to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Centre for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Centre Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I'm Larry Jacobs. I'm a professor here at the Humphrey School. And I want to welcome you to the Humphrey School, which is the professional school of public affairs here at the University of Minnesota. Before we begin, if you're joining us online, you can participate by clicking that button at the bottom that says Q&A. If you're here and you want to submit a question or raise a topic, there'll be folks walking around with cards. Submit them to as many as we possibly can. Also, if you're joining us online, you'll see there's a caption button. If you'd like to use that service, please do. Thank you for joining us today for our special program, St. Augustine from Africa to Pope Leo. Catherine Conybeare has just published magisterial book, Augustine to African, will be the focal point of the book, of this discussion. Here's the book. I've read it. It's fantastic. And I say that as someone who, by no means is an expert. It is just a beautifully crafted book, extremely learned book. So we're going to dig in. Let me first introduce our star, Catherine Conybeare. She's the Leslie Clark Professor in Humanities at Bryn Mawr College. She's a leading scholar of late antiquity. Her research has centered on Augustine of Hippo and themes of emotion and identity in the ancient world, and she is the author of several books. So let's kick things off. Just to level set here, we're not going to assume everybody's on the same page. Professor Conybeare, start us off. Who was Augustine and why is he important?
Augustine was a highly significant figure in the early church. He was born 354 CE, he died 430 CE, so that's the span we're talking about. And he lived through a time of extraordinary change in the Roman Empire in his lifetime. He lived within the Roman Empire, but in North Africa. In his lifetime, the Christianity became the religion of power, the key religion in the empire, but also in his lifetime, Rome was sacked by the Goths. And so there were these fundamental changes in the way in which the whole Roman world was organized. That meant the whole world around the Mediterranean basin. And Augustine was at the heart of those changes. He developed his ideas in response, partly in response to them, and they became fundamental to the Christian church, particularly in the West, because this was the period in which doctrine was solidifying. Even what version of the Bible was read was solidifying. So he's a really fundamental figure in the Western Christian narrative and more broadly in the Western intellectual narrative. That's why I thought it was really interesting when I realized he actually spent pretty much his whole life in North Africa.
Of course, Pope Leo is part of the St. Augustine order. Mm-hmm. What's the significance of that?
I think, as Pope Leo indicated in his initial remarks on being elected, it's deeply part of who he is. And I think that's true in three ways, above all. One is he's inherited the tradition that goes right back to Augustine and to the 4th century of a profoundly interiorized spirituality. It's based on meditation, on reflection, on finding God and Christ within. The second way in which it's really important to him is the Augustinian idea of community. And again, that goes right back to St. Augustine's thought. He was emphatic that community, a city, indeed, the city of God, it's about people. It's not about places, and it's not, above all, it's not about building. I think Pope Leo has really inherited that expansive and person-oriented notion of community. And then third, and this is to do with the Augustinian order itself, more than to do with St. Augustine's own tradition. The Augustinian order is all about service. Augustine's legacy to the West is all about intellectualism. But the Augustinian order is about relating to the wider world and serving people in the wider world. That's really important. And we look at the Pope's service in Peru, of course, as crucial to that.
Obviously, there's been a lot written about St. Augustine, and he's written a lot. What's so special about what you've done?
I think no one before has taken seriously the consequences of the fact that he was looking at the Mediterranean world from the south side. What does that actually mean? What's the landscape around him? What's his view of the powerhouse that in that period is still basically Italy? But in thinking through that landscape, through that situation, I think what's also new about what I've done is I'm relating to him very particularly as a person and not as a promulgator of doctrine. He became, as I traveled there, as I read in close detail so many of his works in their original Latin, he became such a real person to me. He's not an abstraction. He's not just a generator of abstract ideas. He's someone for whom those ideas were forged in a crucible of the place where he was and the people he was surrounded by. And I've tried to bring that out in this book.
The title of the book is Augustine the African. So, just to flesh out what you were saying, that the key theme of your writing is that his place and identity as African is central to him as a person, but also to his writings. What does that mean in practice?
It's a very complicated identity, actually. So first, to be specific, of course, Africa in late antiquity, in the 4th, 5th centuries, is not the Africa we refer to today when we refer to the entire African continent, and perhaps particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Augustine uses the word Africa, but he uses it to mean the northern shore of the African continent, that littoral that stretches from Morocco across Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. He doesn't include Egypt. Egypt is a separate thing conventionally. So it's basically the modern Maghreb that he refers to when he says Africa. And now I've lost track of the second part of your question, Larry. Sorry.
That's a good start. One of the things that really struck me in reading this book is, you've devoted so much time, a career to studying Augustine. And so you would expect, and this is a norm among those who write about an individual, that there's a kind of a bond that develops between the writer and the subject of the writing. And I was really taken with the book that there's an enormous respect for Augustine, but there's not adulation about him. There is a real hesitance, and particularly around the issue of Africa and his identity and place as an African.
Yes, so let me be clear. I'm fascinated by Augustine. I am stimulated by his company. I've become more and more engaged by him as I've read more and more deeply in his work. But once you focus on his African identity, that's not a simple thing. In fact, it's a really complicated thing. It does affect his work in incredibly creative and generative ways. I think the contrast between his view from the south side of the Mediterranean and the fact that he's been acculturated to a Roman point of view. In other words, he's simultaneously from the dominated and the dominant side of the equation. I think that's actually incredibly productive for him. But one of the things I had to take on, and was hard for me to take on as someone who admires Augustine in this book, was above all his attitude to the indigenous African church. There was a branch of the church, a schismatic branch of the church in Africa, or at least he made sure it was defined as schismatic, which was actually the majority church in Africa, as opposed to the Roman church into which he had been baptized and which he served. And he was instrumental in helping to petition the emperor to have this church outlawed, and ultimately in bringing Roman authority and Roman violence to bear on criminalizing this church. And that was really hard for me to confront, given that I was invested in his African identity, and at times, demonstrably, he was invested in his African identity too. And yet, his hostility to the African church was intractable. I think it is almost like has the terrible nature of a family row. It's too close. It's internecine.
Thank you very much, Professor Conybeare. We're very fortunate today to have a very learned panel. So we're going to bring in colleagues from other parts of the university to raise issues, and then we'll come back to Professor Conybeare for comment and further discussion. Our next speaker is going to be Andrew Gallia, who is an associate professor in the history department here at the university, and he specializes in Roman Empire, classical civilizations, and cultural history. Thank you very much, Professor Gallia, for being here. As you've listened to this conversation and read Professor Conybeare's book, what do you see as the broader context for appreciating the thesis that's been presented?
Well, one of the things that I think is coming to this as someone whose primary interests are often earlier in the Roman world, in exactly the point that Catherine was just making about the nature of his African identity is not a sort of modern Pan-African kind of concept, but rather is one that is very much structured by the Roman Empire, by the nature of the Roman Empire and the province of Africa that is created through the conquest of Northern Africa by the Roman Empire. And so he's not really, he's an African of Africa proconsularis, and that I think defines his experience of Africanness. He's certainly not a Mauritanian. He's certainly not an Egyptian, as you say. And I think that's something that you bring really nicely, the detail of that. But out of that also, so in a way, right, it's the Roman Empire's own ability to divide up this larger continent into these smaller provinces that structures a sort of divide and conquer way of thinking about the way he thinks about the local indigenous population of Northern Africa as someone who is in this area that's just sort of in the hinterland of Carthage that was conquered by the Romans. And in thinking about that, there's a sort of a sense in which this is a story that a lot of other people in the Roman Empire also experience. And you can look back to, I mean, practically the vast majority of literary figures that we think of as making up the canon of Latin literature have a sort of ambivalent relationship as both being Romans, but also being people who are from places that were conquered by the Romans. And so I think of like the poet Horace, who's from Venusia, which is this, I mean, it's somewhat major city, but on the edge of the sort of plain of the heel of the boot of Italy. They're kind of a backwater in the time that he comes up. And so he has this ambivalent relationship to coming to Rome to make a name, a career for himself as a poet, but also has this sort of is from a place that only a couple of generations before had joined in an uprising against the Romans and had been reconquered by the Romans, or a couple generations later, the poet Martial, who's from Celtiberia, the sort of last portion of Spain that was finally violently subdued by the Romans, and who comes to Rome, makes a name for himself as a poet, but ultimately returns home and goes back. And so there's a similar negotiating of insider outsider identities that's, I think, common to the ancient Roman Empire more broadly. And I think what I would draw out of that, or the insight that I get from that, is that there need to be more books like this. This is this kind of thinking about the Africanness of Augustine situates and is, it's part of a sort of a way of recognizing the diversity of the voices. And I mean, in all of the particularity that you highlight of what the nature of his experience of being a Roman, but also an African means, actually points to things that are somewhat universal. And I think that one of the critiques that's been brought up against more diversity and more approach injecting diversity into the study of history is that it is divisive, or that it narrows people off from one another. But when in fact, I think bringing in more voices, it actually helps us to see this sort of universal truths that experience that are broadly not just African, but also in other parts.
Thank you so much. We're going to let everyone speak. You've got a pen, so you can keep notes. Do you need a piece of paper? Okay, you'll remember. Professor Gallia, let me move on to another question. Your research on public memory, and meaning in the Roman Empire. I'm curious about its relationship, particularly to Professor Conybeare's discussion of Augustine, and kind of the complex, almost decentralized nature of that.
Yeah, I mean, here, I'm going to talk about my favorite chapter of the book, I guess, which is, and I mean, it's such a wonderful title, Roman Fragility. And this is, I hope I'm not stealing from others, but I mean, that chapter is such a great, I mean, clearly it's echoing the concept of white fragility and the idea that, I hope I'm right in reading that. And there's the sense that in writing The City of God, which is this great theological treatise, that essentially he's dealing with the fact that Rome has been sacked, and he's addressing this reality to say that, well, the way we define what the city is, the true city of God is something different. But he also does his own 1916 project on Roman history, as sort of a reinterpretation, a reimagination of Roman history, to say the sort of self-congratulatory narrative of Roman imperialism as this wonderful, great thing is not what you think it is. It is something that doesn't exist within the truths of Christianity. And so this gets to the issue of memory, and the sort of, I think, again, you could argue that there is ambivalence around many of the things that Augustine so clearly lays out in The City of God, the opening of The City of God, about sort of taking a different perspective, taking the view of the subjected people to critique the dominant narrative of that. But it's certainly, he is a master of reading.
Thank you very much, Professor Gallia. I want to now turn to Professor Andrea Sterk, who's an associate professor of history here at the university, specializing in Christianity and late antiquity and Byzantine. Professor Sterk, wandering is the name of a chapter in Professor Conybeare's book, and it's a theme in her telling of St. Augustine's story, both his wandering from North Africa to Rome, and then the wandering back to North Africa, and then the wandering of the refugees from the fallen Rome back to Africa. And I'd be interested in your thinking about how Augustine's theological vision was shaped by this wandering of an African identity.
Thanks. Well, let me say, I wanted to comment on two topics. One of them that very much relates to wandering and picking up on this question of multiple identities that both Catherine and Andy have commented on. I'll come back, bring it back to, do I need to speak into this?
Yeah.
Sorry. I'll bring it back to wandering. So first of all, the nature of Christianity and the problem of multiple identities. I wanted to start with the tensions in Christianity itself between the global and the local, the universal and the regional. My own work focuses more on the Eastern Mediterranean, and I should say that beyond North Africa, already in Augustine's day, there were many local, ethnically, nationally, linguistically distinct Christian identities. Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, soon to be followed by Arab and Slavic Christian identities. So multiple identities were not just a tension for Augustine as a Christian in Africa. And there were not only differences between regional expressions of Christianity, but also tensions within local Christian identities. And for Augustine, in his tension between his African and Roman identity, his Africanness usually won out, as Catherine demonstrates throughout the book. As a bishop and preacher in North Africa, he consistently embraced and identified with his local context, whether through language, interpretation of the Bible, or his view of Rome and its fragility. There was one major theological issue in which Augustine sided with the universal over the local. Although he appealed to African foundations for his argument, and this was a controversy in which he argued for the universal nature of the Christian church. The church spread throughout the whole world as over against a more purist, exclusivist African identity. In general, while negotiating multiple identities, though, he sought to relate to and unify diverse groups. And even in his monumental City of God, as Catherine wonderfully brings out in the book, he was shaped deeply by his own identity as an African wanderer, never feeling fully at home anywhere, either in Italy, where he spent only 5 years, but also in Africa, in the various locations where he lived. But in the City of God, he sought to show people of all classes and backgrounds that we are equally wanderers, that we are all desperately seeking home and finding it ultimately only in the eternal city. And I think what I appreciated here, and Catherine brings out in the book, is Augustine's profound understanding of human nature, our common experiences of wandering, of displacement, our kind of restless human longing. And in that wandering, our need for community, which is rooted in local places. And I think last point on this, that Pope Leo, formed in the Augustinian order, of course, has inherited and embodies something of this tension between the global and the local, with citizenship in two countries, though his true home, he would say, transcends them both. And also, of course, Leo was formed in a tradition that understands the importance of community and that cultivates community as a basis for service in the world.
I want to follow up on that point about Pope Leo, given his significance. The Catholic Church is and is increasingly a global church. It's fast, quickly spreading in Africa, in Latin America, Mexico. 60% or more identify as Catholic. Do you see the increasing attention, particularly with Professor Conybeare's work on Augustine's foundations in Africa, as contributing or reinforcing that notion of the Catholic Church as global?
I think It does, but there's this constant tension, and they both need, they're there in Augustine, and they're there very much today, between the idea of the universal and local expressions of Christianity. So I think it's wonderful to have a pope who does, in a sense, bring these together and represents this sort of human reality.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to turn to Dwight Lewis, who is also a colleague here at the University of Minnesota. Professor Lewis is in the philosophy department, and he is co-director of the Center for Canon Expansion and Change. His research explores human difference, Africana, and early modern philosophy and the philosophy of race. And Professor Lewis, I want to ask you, just point out, flat out, do you agree with Professor Conybeare's characterization of Augustine's identity as African? And do you think this has been missed or neglected?
Yeah, I think this is a hard, tough question. As we know, we've got a whole book about it. I guess I want to start by saying that, we have to understand the impact of colonization, right, of colonialism. And so when we talk about Augustine in relationship to his identity, it's really hard to form your identity as the colonized, right? And so there's a way where Augustine is existing in a tough space, right? He's existing in a space where he's trying to define himself, but in a world that is already defined. And so there's ways where he's going to be, back and forth. And I think that we see this a lot in Catherine's book. I do want to, so I'm going to speak on this, but as you see, I'm running from it right now. But I want to just give a little quick overview of this argument. I am a philosopher, so I'm going to give an overview of the argument really fast. And then respond. So she starts part one, talking about his Africanness and the ways that it undermines his integration into Roman culture, right? So when he goes to Italy, the way that he speaks, the way that he moves is of course going to be intrinsically African, as that's where he's coming up from. And so that's going to cause tension, right? And defines and is defining him as African to some extent. Part two talks about the complexity of being, when he returns to Africa, right, at being home in Africa as both an imperial functionary, but also a local son, right? So he's, in a very tough position. And as me and Andrea were talking, right, as bishop, he ends up, presiding over court cases and all different types of things. So to be in this position, but to also be this local son, is just a tough space. So yeah, part three, Catherine connects his Africanness through language, both local, but also through his rural examples and land examples, right? So the ways that he's making examples from his home, not examples from a Roman home, right? And so this is also something that culturally is defining him as African, right? And then point number four, part four, he focuses away from earthly empires, as we heard from Andy, and his dislocation, and he's dislocated, which you would be as colonized, right? He's wondering which you would be as colonized, right, in your identity, in your culture. And then he's got this power from inside, but he's also an outsider, right? Again, this idea of being, an imperial functionary and a local son. And she ends with this lost son idea, and I love it because he is truly lost, but lost in being colonized, right? He's Roman and not. He is African yet estranged, right? And it's the same. What's funny is that, estranged in the way that when you leave your home, right, and you get you become even more colonized there's a way that like when you try to come back home, it's not going to feel as comfortable, right? And this is something that Carter Woodson wrote in 1933 in this text, The Miseducation of the Negro. He talks about the ways that like Black folks are growing up in a particular community, and then they move into the professional world and, you know, look around this room, right? And they spend, you know, a lot of time in a white world. And then they try to go back to that, to their where they're coming from, and there's a tension there, right? And so this lost son really like grabbed me, Catherine. I'm really glad. I'm really glad you brought that up. But from these 4 points, what we get is that his influence is, at least from Catherine's point of view, is profoundly inseparable from his African roots and connection through time, right? As he starts his life there, he's really almost completely in Africa, right? He's not actually outside of Africa often. And I do think that Catherine is trying to get to that this challenges the European reading of Augustine. And there's a further step, I think, which is a recentering of Africa as a formative basin for Christian thought, right? And I think it's the second thesis that I think that most people would you know, at least in the Western Church, would push against, right? Not that it challenges the Eurocentric reading, but that it recenters, right? Africa as the formative basin. And for me, maybe I am not as tied to this. Like I'm gonna give critique that I don't really care that much about, but this is what philosophers do. But other people probably do care about this. Africa, so I think most people would say, you know, this isn't about Africa being recentered or the center, but it's about adding context, right? Where they want to be like, I'm not going to say this, but I'm going to say this. This is the video, right? That we need to make sure the things that the cops have done has been done, right? It's context, it's not recentering. Partly people might say because Augustine rarely explicitly reflects on his African identity. He's also trained in such a Western way, such a Roman way. Number two, so that's one point. Number two, there's a point where Catherine says there's that it upends core ideas of Christianity. And someone might say, well, Origen, Tertullian, these people they've already been here, and already complicate the narrative, right? So they might say something like that. Number three, if his African is not an erasure, like that his Africanness has not been erased, but that this is the way that the West relates to the continent of Africa in general. There's not much like focus on that in general. So I'm not saying these are my critiques, Catherine, but I'm saying I think these are critiques that might be floating around the room. And so I'm gonna keep going because I'm sorry, Larry, but I'm trying to racialize this in certain ways. But Pauline Hongchang Ji, who's a professor at the National University of Benin. He was also the Minister of Education and Culture for Benin. Writes this book, African Philosophy, Myth and Reality. And I was like, this connects well with what you're doing. But what he's trying to do in there is define something or someone's work as African or Africana. And he gives some ideas of what he believes define someone as African. And that's why I'm here, Catherine. One, he's just is like, well, if you're born in Africa, then your work is African, right? He's like, clearly, especially if you have that cultural background, which Augustine definitely did. So I think under this first point for Hongtong Ji, he would be like, yes, African fully. And then he also talks about the ways that, we have this diaspora, right? which is Africana. And Africana really is focused on the ways that Blackness is treated in the world, right? And those people that can have phenomenal experiential sense datum, or I'm not just here I go philosophy, that experiential knowledge from moving through the world as Black, right, and writing about that, right? And I think that Augustine does do that based on what Patrick was saying also, but this also allows someone to still be considered as an African thinker or an Africana thinker, even if they are born in the West, even if they're born in the East, now, even if they're born in Latin America, right? But because they are still experiencing the experience of moving into the world a particular way. In the same way, I'm going to give one example. I'm sorry, I know I'm probably over time, but in the same way, like, I don't know, there's certain epistemology, certain knowings I don't know about moving through I can't know about moving through the world as a woman, right? I just can't have the phenomenal experience with doing that, right? And so there's particular knowings that women have because of that movement through the world. And Africana is really focused on those particular movements based on being raised. And so I would say, I think Catherine does a great job of defining Augustine as an African. I think there are just like where I may push Catherine is also on the second thesis of recentering, because I just don't, you know, if this was the case, you know, we would already be looking at an African Pope, right? I think, yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Lewis. That was very provocative. Now I want to turn to Professor Conybeare. You've heard a lot, this terrific set of comments. Thoughts, reactions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for engaging so deeply. I actually want to focus specifically on the notion of the universal, which came up in both Professor Gallia and Professor Sterk's comments, and that relates to Professor Lewis's primary and not illegitimate critique about recentering. So the Professor Gallia pointed out that including diversity in account makes the viewpoint more universal. And I heard that and I thought, but yes, there's the trap of the universal as well. And that relates to what Professor Sterk was saying too. So she's saying that Augustine's arguing for the universal Christian church as opposed to what she called a purist African identity. I think Augustine worked very hard to attach the term universal to his idea of the church. And you read his sermons against this schismatic movement, and he is using the term, and it's the same as in modern English, Catholic. He's saying Catholicus again and again and again. He's imposing the notion that his own church is universal and the opponents are not universal because they stand outside it and in opposition to it. So there's this, in a way, dangerous and in fact non-inclusive imposition of the term universal to exclude opponents. And I think in the reception of Augustine's thought, and this goes to both Professor Gallia's and Professor Lewis's intervention, the notion of the universal has really been a problem for him, because it's not as if, I haven't pointed out anything new in saying that Augustine was African. Anyone who works on Augustine and looks at a map and finds out where he was born knows that. But what's happened again and again is people have said, well, yes, he was African, but he was really Roman. And the African bits don't count. And then they say, and explicitly or not, they say, and Roman, the Roma perspective is the universal one. So again, the universalism, there's a real universalism trap there. There's this generalization out from the dominant viewpoint that was incontrovertibly Rome's to a quote unquote universal viewpoint. And I'm trying to push back against that. Yes, Augustine is deeply implicated in all sorts of ways in the dominant viewpoint and the viewpoint that comes out of this formative period in the church and the Western world that comes out victorious. But there is still this specificity. So to go to the critique about providing context, not recentering, that point is really well taken. But I think that in insisting on this African context, a certain recentering is taking place. Not, as I said before, not a recentering of the whole African continent. That would be anachronistic. Though in recognizing that anachronism, I think one can carry more of Africa along with it. But in this case, context, perhaps let's not say recentering, which I think was my publicist's words, but reconsideration. I mean, Hegel famously says Africa doesn't have a history. And of course, that's nonsense. And so I've written a tiny little bit of this local history and disproved that. Hegel also makes this really weird backhanded exception for North Africa, but it's backhanded. So that's just picking one point from each of your responses, and thank you both all so much for them.
Thank you very much. So we've got limited time, but I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to raise one brief question. And if you've got a point you want to add on as part of your question, just raise two hands and I'll recognize you. Professor Sterk, why don't we start with you?
What? No, wait.
Did you have a point you wanted to raise in response to what you've heard? It's okay, we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Professor Lewis.
I don't have one either.
Okay.
Well, I have a question, but I also have a
Oh,
comment.
okay, ask the question.
One thing, Catherine, that you don't talk about as much, which I think really fits well with your whole treatment of Augustine, is his role as a bishop. And he not only was in the Roman context, as Dwight said, yeah, he was doing things like arbitrating lawsuits, but he was also appealing to the emperor on behalf of the poor and suffering, also quashing his theological rivals, which of course is not a nice story, but petitions on behalf of the poor and suffering. And the slave trade, there's this wonderful example of a letter that he writes about slave traders coming to North Africa and taking free peasants, kidnapping them, hundreds of them, and shipping them off to estates in Europe, in Italy and southern France. And the slave traders are in collusion with the authorities in Africa. And he's involved in so many levels on this. And this is not a unique situation to Africa, but it very much, is a situation that, as a bishop in North Africa, affects him, and he cares about. He makes petitions about sanctuary, protecting the poor, so many things like that. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about his role as a bishop.
Yes, that's a fantastic multi-layered question, and that letter is beyond fascinating about the status of these enslaved people, whom he's bought off, and he's trying to determine where to place them, as it were. I think yes, you're absolutely right. I didn't dwell much on his role specifically as bishop, except in terms of his preaching and his attempt to reach out to people, even to Punic speakers in North Africa. I think actually that goes back to the genesis of the book, why I didn't. So the genesis of the book was from a handful of places, and there are only a handful across the whole of Augustine's writings, where he himself signals that he is hyper aware that he is African and speaking from an African perspective. And I joined up the dots on those pieces. And in fact, each of those excerpts is at the core, at the kernel of one of the four parts of the book. And I didn't find moments where I felt in his episcopal actions that you're citing, where I felt he was acting with his African identity in the forefront as opposed to his episcopal identity. I think there could be an entire extra section written on this. It would need a lot more work and thought, but it could be. Thank you for pointing that out.
I think
Yeah.
some of the situations.
Professor
were
Lewis?
easy to have. Yeah.
Again, concise, short question.
My question is more about like framing. So I feel like at this point, like a lot of scholars, especially when they're writing about a different culture or someone that's coming from a different cultural background, forefront their own positionality to like let people know that like I'm speaking about something that like I really don't know all about, and I can't be objective in this. And so I'm just wondering about, and I did read in your acknowledgments, right, where you brought up some of this stuff, but I'm just wondering why there wasn't like a preface or something speaking to your positionality and how that differs from Augustine.
Well, I would say none of us ever embarks on a book knowing all about our subject or able totally to submerge in the subject. I originally had a more extended self-identification in the introduction of my positionality. I think my editor found it mawkish, and he took it out. It would be interesting to start by saying what I'm not, but in a way, I am none of the things Augustine is. You know, I'm not from Africa. I'm not a bishop. I'm in the 4th century, and I don't know, to go back, Dwight, to your example, I don't know what it is to move through the world as an African, though I do know what it is to move through the world as a woman. So I brought what I could to what I hope is not a starry-eyed, but an empathetic study. And what I could bring was my own slightly exilic sensibility as someone who has made my life in a country that is not my own. And the other thing that deeply imbues this book that comes from my perspective, I think, is as a parent. Being a parent is incredibly important to me. It was incredibly complicated to me. It's complicated to be a parent as a female academic, particularly if you have a baby in graduate school. And one of the things, right back at the beginning, Larry asked me what's new about this book, and I could have filled the hour and bored you all talking about that. But one of the things that is new is, bizarrely to me, no one before, as far as I know, has linked the death of his son and his lostness in the aftermath of that death to his turn, not to Christianity, that had already happened, but his turn to a role in the institutional church. And that's something that I felt very deeply, and I think I noted because of my own complex parenting role. It's something I would like to write on more, really, subsequently.
I want to just give Professor Gallia.
Yeah,
I'm just make a comment on this, and I think what you're illustrating so touchingly here is one of the leitmotifs in your book is you come back over and over to Augustine's reaction to reading the death of Dinah in Virgil's Aeneid, and how this complicates his relationship with Roman culture. Virgil's Aeneid is this canonical text, but also as an African, this Carthaginian queen who kills herself as Aeneas sails away. And I mean, my Wellesley-educated high school Latin teacher also felt a great deal of sympathy for Dido in that scene, and I, as consequently, you know, did as well. And I think that the issue here is empathy. And so I had to come back to, I think, the point that you very readily made about the trap of the universal. That sense of it's the universal that I think that I want to be framing there is one of empathy. That sort of, yes, we cannot all share the experience of people who go through the world in different bodies, but we can have some empathy. We can try to understand.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here from the audience. I want to try to get them involved. Several questions basically say, use the term African, which has a whole diversity of meanings and contexts today, but also back 300 and 400. So why use a term that has such different and sometimes conflicting meanings?
Yeah, that of course is a question at the heart of the book invites by its very title. And I was conscious in calling it Augustine the African, and the project in my mind has been called this all along, that was in some sense misdirection, because it's absolutely correct that what we mean when we say African now, as I mentioned earlier, is not what Augustine meant when he said African. I justify that by the fact that this is actually the term he used. I think I could have called it Augustine the Numidian. He was born right on the border between Numidia and Africa Proconsularis. And I think that would have conveyed nothing to a modern audience. I think in the end, I decided to go with this title, feeling initially its misdirection. If you pick up the book, you'll find how it's qualified, but you also have something to push back against. And to go back to Dwight's questioning about bringing Africa into the conversation, about it being, even if it doesn't manage wholly to recenter, about it being something deeper than just context, just the background in a video. I thought it was important to hang on to that term because this is a retracing of Europe's debt to someone who is not European. It's a deep debt, an intellectual debt, as well as a Christian doctrinal debt. And that's worth saying, even if we have to qualify what we mean by African. That would be my response, I think.
So I want to bring our conversation back to this moment and to this place where we have experienced in Minnesota and Minneapolis horrific violence of a variety of sorts, including the assassination of a state legislator, but also the murder of George Floyd. And so at a time of intensifying conflict, when violence seems to be so close to the surface and part of our daily life, is there a place for Augustine's notion of grace in our life? And is it relevant? Is it just a kind of fluffy thing, or do you see it as having a kind of concrete tangibility?
I think it's fundamental, Larry. And I think he would be the first person to acknowledge in humility that he didn't always manage to extend that grace to others, but he was deeply committed to the idea of God's grace. That's absolutely at the heart of his theology. God's grace being something that is given to us unearned. He uses the word gratis, which is the same in Latin and in English. But there's something beyond the transactional nature of the everyday that we ourselves personally, and he would say, representing and channeling God, can extend to each other. I don't think one needs to believe in his or any God to strive quite consciously to extend that grace, that generosity, and that openness beyond, as I say, the transactional to each other. And I think it's crucial in this moment.
Thank you very much for that. I think that comes as welcome. We have had such a great conversation. I've got a stack of questions here. I know my panelists have a stack of questions, but alas, we've run short of time. So I want to thank our terrific panelists, Professor Andrea Sterk, Professor Dwight Lewis, and Professor Andy Gallia. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Catherine Conybeare for this phenomenal book. If you haven't read it, you need to. And for coming. Professor Conybeare is traveling all over the world. I just learned recently that her book was presented to the Pope. And so we're honored to have you here. Thank you so much.
Last week, believe it or not.
So I want to just mention very quickly some upcoming programs that our center is putting on. We'll be continuing our series of Conservative Voices, which is bringing in diverse perspectives that I've been doing with former Congressman Vin Weber. We're also going to be holding an important conversation on October 8th, Wednesday, as part of our center's certificate in election administration. It is on the tangible career in election administration and features a short but extremely powerful and pungent documentary about the heroic work of election officials. This is really the front lines in democracy. If you'd like to learn about this idea of working in election administration, please come to that. There'll be several local election officials there. On November 6th, Steve Hahn, who's won a Pulitzer, will be here. He's written about illiberal chapters in America. So what is going on now with Donald Trump? Not new. There has been chapters going back really to the founding of the country. And Steve Hahn is going to take on the task of saying, how did we move from those illiberal moments into moments in which rights were expanded, in which dignity was expanded? And I hear a lot of people kind of yearning for what's next. He's a terrific historian. I encourage you to come to that. That's in collaboration with Westminster Town Hall Forum, and we'll be in their space. November 12th, former U.S. Senator Russ Feingold will be here talking about deep partisan divisions and some of the threats to democracy, including his career-long effort to bring in control money. And then rounding out our program on November 18th will be our latest installment in the Mondale Dialogues. It will be with really, I'd say, a fascinating speaker, PBS host, Alexander Hefner. He's going to be talking about his work looking at, of all things, budgeting and how budgeting can be a way in which people come to understand what is going on around them and perhaps peel away some of the deep cynicism. Okay, all of these are hybrid. You can follow them online. You can come join us. We love all of that. You folks come back. There'll be a video of this conversation that will be online in YouTube, 1 or 2 days. You can search it by looking up Dialogue Across Difference. And please come check that out. It'll be the caliber of what you've just seen today. Finally, these programs do not just happen. There's tremendous staff here. Lee Chittenden back here runs our center. Lee, you want to give a little shout out? And Cody Jackett has been working on this particular panel and others for literally months. So I want to give a shout out to those folks and then give a shout out to you all. If you enjoy this kind of program, please contribute. It is the only way it will continue. Once again, thank you to this panel. Thank you to Professor Conybeare. Thanks to all of you for joining us.